Civilization. In this video, we're going to be talking about ancient Mesopotamia, focusing specifically on the civilization of ancient Sumer. Here are your key terms and key questions. By the end of this video, you should be able to define all those terms you see off to the right, and you should also be able to give decent answers to these 4 questions that you see here. Let's start by talking about the geography of Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia is right in the heart of what we consider today to be the Middle East. Mesopotamia literally means, in Greek I think, the land between rivers. Meso meaning middle, and Potamia coming from the word potomoi for rivers. So anyway, the 2 rivers that define Mesopotamia are the Tigris and the Euphrates, which you can see there on the map, the 2 blue lines, the Tigris being the one on top. And so what's important about this area is that it's geographically isolated and also very, very fertile. That is good for growing crops. So it's geographically isolated because all around Mesopotamia are deserts or very rugged mountains, which are hard for people to get through even today, much more so, 5,000 years ago. So this is like a protected area, and the people there are able to build up their civilization without too much threat at first from outside invaders. So Mesopotamia not only is isolated, but it's also very fertile. But it's also dry. It doesn't rain there. The fertility of the soil comes from the water in the rivers. And using the water in the rivers, they're able to begin to grow very effectively many new crops like wheat and barley and peas and cows and sheep and so on. And growing this stuff around the rivers is actually very efficient. But because it never rains, it requires a lot of large-scale organization. You need to get teams of people together to dig channels to divert the water of the river to your fields, and also to split up the water in a way that's fair for everybody. So this leads to a big growth in population, but also to a more complex organization of society. A little bit more at agriculture in Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia is part of a larger region known as the Fertile Crescent. So you can see on the map there that green area that includes Mesopotamia and also the east coast of the Mediterranean Sea. All that area there is actually wet enough to grow crops. All around it though are really dry deserts and mountains. So what actually happened is that about, I think, 12,000 years ago, agriculture began up at the northern part of the Fertile Crescent, up in the foothills of the mountains in what is modern-day Turkey. And these people depended on rain to feed their agriculture. And this worked, but it wasn't very effective because it didn't always rain. There wasn't a lot of rain, and so agriculture wasn't super efficient. But as time goes on, agriculture spreads southward down the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And societies learn to work together to channel the river water to irrigate their crops. And this is way more efficient because now instead of having to wait for it to rain, you have a constant supply of water flowing with the rivers. And this is super, super efficient, and irrigated agriculture is the thing that allows for the first civilization to begin. Up in what is modern-day Turkey, where agriculture first started, there was no civilization. There were just small, decentralized farming villages. But as we go down into Mesopotamia, you start to see huge cities that are centralized and have all the aspects of a civilization. And so why is irrigated agriculture so efficient? 2 reasons. One is that, as I've already mentioned, the water from the river is a very reliable source, so you don't have to wait for rain. And 2, the rivers actually flood every year, sometimes multiple times a year. And this flooding spreads nutrient-rich soil all along the banks of the river. And so anything you plant there is going to grow way faster than it would otherwise. It's basically like free miracle grow. And so because of this, the people who are growing grains on the side of the rivers can produce a yield of 30 to 1. That means for each little grain of wheat that you plant, you get 30 back, which is huge, and this allows for a big surplus of food and for the emergence of a complex civilization. And so it's because of irrigated agriculture that we see the emergence of the first major cities, and these are the cities of ancient Sumeria in that purple area down near the Persian Gulf. A bit more at what the Sumerian city-states looked like. So there's a picture there. It's an artist's rendition. It's hard to say how accurate it is, but what I want you to look at is how it's this system of fields located right next to the river, and how there are these channels dug off the river. See the big one going through the city, and smaller ones branching off to water the fields. So even though it never really rains in Sumeria, they're able to grow lots and lots of crops by using the river water. So anyway, so the Sumerian city-states, they're called city-states because they are cities, but each city is its own independent government. Nobody rules over these cities. Each city is kind of like a little mini kingdom, and each one of these cities has its own king. And so on top of this, each city-state was basically self-sufficient. They grew all the stuff they needed for themselves. And at first there was relatively limited trade between these different city-states. They were basically like little islands of civilization separated by miles and miles of wilderness, usually deserts or swamp. So this is the very beginning of civilization. It's just little isolated cities. In these cities, we see a social system develop that we call social stratification or social hierarchy. And what this meant is there was basically a pyramid structure in that society where kings ruled over everybody. And then there was a middle group that consisted of like priests and soldiers and skilled craftsmen who got some benefits. And then at the very bottom, the largest part of the pyramid, were the peasants. The peasants basically grew all the food and gave most of their food up in return for the protection of the soldiers and the stuff the craftsmen make and the divine blessings of the priest. And so that was a system of social stratification that began in ancient Sumer, and that basically continues for most of civilization. We will see the same sort of pyramid structure in every civilization that we study. And another thing we see in Sumeria is monumental architecture. Huge buildings constructed of brick, mostly. And this is stuff like walls, massive palaces, and also, most famously for Sumeria, ziggurats. They're these big pyramidal structures, you'll see a picture of them on the next slide, that served as temples. So on the top of this huge pyramid, they would build a temple, and there the king or the high priest would go up to the top of the temple to talk with the gods, and also to perform secret religious ceremonies. More about religion in ancient Sumer. So the sort of religion practiced here, and practiced in many other ancient civilizations, can be categorized as anthropomorphic polytheism. Anthropomorphic means man-like or human-like. Polytheism means that you worship many gods. So anthropomorphic polytheism is a religion in which you worship many gods, and these gods look and act a lot like human beings. And so the specific beliefs in ancient Sumer included stuff like the Mesopotamians believed that the natural world was governed by different deities, like there was a god of the sun and a god of the sky and a god of love and war and stuff like that. Also, they believed that the gods were not always very nice. The climate in Mesopotamia was unforgiving. There were horrible floods and droughts and stuff like that. And so they concluded that the gods punished mankind for no good reason a lot of the time. And so because of this, they developed the belief that they needed to continually sacrifice and worship the gods in order to avoid the gods' anger. And so this belief sort of naturally developed into a governmental system known as theocracy. And so theocracy means rule by a god or rule by the divine. And so what this means in Mesopotamia is that the kings who ruled the city-states were actually viewed by their subjects as being godlike, having supernatural powers. And so the king's main job, on top of leading the army in battle, was talking to the gods and getting the gods to basically be nice to a particular city-state. And so all of this is linked back to the Mesopotamians' basic beliefs about the nature of the gods being anthropomorphic and not necessarily very nice. Up in the top right, you can see a picture of the ziggurat, and you can see a big procession with the king being led up to the temple to communicate with the gods. Thing that happens in ancient Sumeria, and maybe the biggest thing that happens in the history of civilization, is the emergence of a system of writing. This is a huge deal both for the people at the time and also for historians, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the system of writing that develops in ancient Sumeria, for the first time ever, the system of writing is known as cuneiform, and it begins as simple pictures. So you can see there on the right, the earliest pictures were basically just like very childlike drawings of stuff. So like the donkey actually looks like a donkey, the grain looks like a piece of grain. But as time goes on, these very basic pictures develop into more stylized and symbolic images. And they have this huge breakthrough where they realize that a couple little triangles stacked in a particular way could convey the message of some actual thing, that they could symbolize real things with pictures. And so it's interesting to think about how writing developed, because of course for most of human history, for the first 490,000 years of human history, we didn't have writing, and we had to convey everything through word of mouth. The reason it develops in Sumer is because of complicated economics. In the ancient city-states, economics was becoming more complicated as more stuff was produced and different types of things were being traded all over the place. And merchants and governments needed to be able to keep track of all the various trades that they made. So, you know, if you were going to trade like 20 sheep for 10, like 100 pounds of grain or whatever, you would write this down by basically stamping out the pictures of the things you were trading. And this very basic system of recording exchange developed over time into a much more complex and sophisticated system of writing that people can still read today. But so why does this matter? Why is writing so important? It's really important for three reasons. One, it leads to the faster and more accurate transmission of ideas. Before writing existed, if you wanted to spread an idea to somebody else, you had to say it to them. And of course, this slows down the transmission of ideas, and it also makes the transmission of ideas less accurate. You guys have all played that game Telephone, right? Where you start out with one message, and after 20 people have repeated it, it's a totally different message. Same idea with writing. If you write something down, the message is not altered as it passes from person to person. Second, it leads to more effective government. You cannot govern a city unless you have accurate information. And the emergence of writing allows for more accurate information to get filtered up to the king so he can make rational choices with what he's going to do in the city-state. And finally, it's very, very important today because this provides a new way of understanding societies. Before the emergence of writing, historians were forced basically to look at archaeological and anthropological remains. But now with writing, we can actually read the ideas of the people from thousands and thousands of years ago. And so we know more about ancient Sumeria than we do about any other civilization that came before it, thanks to the development of cuneiform. So that was ancient Sumer and a brief introduction to Mesopotamia. Tomorrow we are going to look some more at Mesopotamia, focusing on the development of the world's first empires. Alright guys, thanks a lot for paying attention, and make sure you can answer these questions before you stop thinking about all of this stuff for the day.